Welcome students to week 4 of HLTH 3102 Qualitative Methods for Social Health Research. This week you'll be introduced to qualitative interviewing. Hopefully by now you are getting used to the routine of watching the lecture, doing the readings and completing your worksheet. This week, along with your readings, there is only one video from Professor Grebich on qualitative interviewing. In regards to your recent submission of your draft literature review, your tutors will have commenced marking and will be able to return to you some feedback within 10 days as per the Statement of Assessment Methods. As you'll shortly hear from Professor Grebich, qualitative interviewing is one method for data collection. For your assignment, you will have the option of collecting your data either by conducting 4 single face-to-face interviews or a combination of focus group and 2 interviews. On the FAQs on Flow, I've posted some replies to some student queries about how long the interview should take and how many questions you could be asking. In the upcoming video, Professor Grebich will tell you more about the format of interviews and will help you understand how important it is to correctly design your questions to get the most from your time that you have with your participants. This will then determine how long your interview will be and how many questions you might wish to consider asking your participants. Some of the resources I've posted on Flow will help you put this into context. These will give you some great examples of the types of interviews and types of questions you could be asking. If you catch the bus to uni or have a long commute like I do, why not download some Conversations podcasts by Richard Fidler? You can access these on your iPhone podcast app and download the interviews and listen to Richard interview a range of people. For example, the links that I've posted include a young man who recently suffered a brain stem stroke and suffered locked-in syndrome. In this interview, you can hear the lived experience of this man as he describes the onset of the stroke and then the resulting effects of paralysis and later his rehabilitation. Another link I posted was of a sister whose brother suddenly went missing. You can hear the angst in her voice of not knowing where her brother is and how she worked tirelessly and helplessly with the authorities to try and locate her brother, who was deemed to be a non-suspicious missing person. The movie resources that you might like to consider watching include Liam Neeson as the sexual researcher Alfred Kinsey, who researched married couples in the 1940s. As you can imagine, talking about intimacy post-World War II was considered a taboo topic, which made gathering data by interviews really challenging. The other 2 movies, The Laramie Project and The Guys, are movies based on theatre productions, which were of actual events. The Laramie Project is based on the 1998 hate crime murder of a gay student, Matthew Shepard. The play is based on a series of interviews with the residents of Laramie, which are featured in the production. The Guys is based on interviews conducted by a journalist who was asked to help a New York City firefighter captain write the eulogies for his company who lost their lives during the events of 9/11. So now I'll hand you over to Professor Grebich and come back with a short summary.
The purpose, though, let's look at face-to-face interviewing in this particular segment, is to actually find out what it is the person has experienced, what views they have on a particular issue which you've decided is fairly important in terms of your research question. There are some options there in terms of where you might stand as the interviewer. You might be subjective. Now, subjective is an interesting one because it means that you're actually not only just recording the interview, but observing your own position in that interview, your own experience. So it's a bit like a stream of consciousness that you'll monitor and put into your diary, and it becomes like a parallel piece of data, which is important and may come into the display in the results section. Empathetic is just a normal face-to-face interview, which is usually very relaxed, just 2 people basically having a conversation, and that's the ideal in qualitative and the one that's done most. The distant investigative is to do with interviewing up and elite interviews. So when you're interviewing someone who's the head of an organisation, you have a different length of time and different type of interview. And again, we'll do a little bit more on that one because I know a number of people are quite interested in doing that. Various issues that you just need to bear in mind before you race out into the field. Appropriate things like dress, and particularly if you're interviewing up, you need to be sort of smart casual. Issues of gender, how are you going to manage any issues that might arise there? It often is more difficult to interview someone of the opposite sex. People are often a little bit distrustful, it takes a bit of a while to settle down and relax. So take that into account when you're planning your interview. Ethnicity, if they're from a different racial group, there may be language difficulties. There may also be discomfort in terms of the distance that you sit from them. The Anglo-Celtic distance is about 1.5 meters. For example, a number of Asian people actually like to sit alongside you as opposed to face to face. So there are different ways of doing it, and just learn to be comfortable with whatever the participant looks as though they're going to be best interviewed in that particular situation. Age is an interesting one. Again, if you're interviewing people who are much older or much younger, requires patience and some other skills. And status, people of much higher status who may regard you as being very much the bottom of the pecking order just because you're a student. You just have to learn how to deal with that and just to hang in there. Your diary, make sure that's detailed. It's a totally idiosyncratic document and you can maintain it in any way that you think fit, whether you just do it as a computer record, whether you put it onto a tape recorder each night and type it up in the end, or whether you just scrawl it in your own handwriting, is irrelevant. There's no length that it has to be. It's just a good record of what it is that you're actually doing. Okay, so you're about to go out and do an interview. Let's have a look at some of the things that you might need to be aware of. First of all, you have to get access to people. You have to explain to them all the ethical issues, that they don't have to answer the questions. They can pull out at any time if they want to. You develop some rapport with them. Usually have a bit of a chit-chat, a cup of tea or coffee before you start the interview, and it allows them to ask any questions that might actually be concerning them before you settle in to take this actual interview and record it. Recording techniques, whatever works for you is fine, but just make sure that whatever techniques you use are actually working. If you're going to record in, say, a coffee bar or in a park or somewhere like that, you must use lapel mics, because otherwise you're going to pick up all the sounds of the people having coffee and all the chatty conversations, or if you're outside it'll pick up all the traffic noises. So make sure you've got the appropriate equipment and test it and trial it before, with someone else before you actually do the interview. Watch your body language and watch their body language. If you're a particularly nervous type of person and you click pens and you rub your nose and run your finger along your chin and sort of do all these sorts of things, they're very distracting to other people in an interview situation. And if they're demonstrating any of those sorts of things, you might want to slow the interview down or stop it, maybe talk through whatever the issues might be that are problematic. And you can see at the bottom of that slide, informal data is the stuff that isn't recorded. It's the chit-chat that you have before you start the interview and the sort of debriefing that you have after. And that data is real data, and it's equally important as the stuff that you've actually recorded. So use it as an observation and take notes as soon as you leave the setting, in case the stuff there, which is very important in terms of the data that you're actually gathering. Guided is when you go out with several question areas in the back of your head and you just simply keep referring to those. You don't actually have anything written down on paper. Standardised is when you go out with a whole list of questions. It's usually a large study where there's a whole lot of interviewers and they need to ask similar questions at a similar point in the interview so that you can have some sort of comparative data. Okay, moving on then. What sort of preparation do you need to do? Well, make sure that you find a quiet place. That is almost impossible if you're interviewing up, because it's usually the office of that person and there are phones going and people coming and going and urgent things that have to be signed. So you have to deal with that and try and keep on track with the interview. Explain what the process is, how long it's going to be and what you're going to do with the data. Address issues of confidentiality and anonymity and ethics. Those are all very important. Explain what you're going to do with if you're going to send back the transcript for them to have a look at, let them know that. Perhaps make sure that they can ask you any questions, or they've got your phone number if they want to follow up on anything, and you've got theirs, so that when you have a look at the preliminary data analysis, you might realise there's some other things that you want to double check. So that may be fairly important to do. If the interview starts straying off into a whole range of different directions, just use the technique of just saying, well, okay, now we've done this, and this, and you start to rein it in, and I now would like to go on to that. So keep control of the interview. Don't let it just become a sort of total chit-chat about people that you know in common. Try and keep it on the topic and summarise at the end. Give them an opportunity to add anything that they might not have had an opportunity to say. So you're conducting your interview. You've made sure that your recording device is actually working. Make sure that you don't ask complex questions, double-barreled or triple-barreled or quadruple-barreled, just because you're a bit nervous. So don't say, well, how do you feel about that? And then what happened? That's actually a 2-in-1 question. So don't do that. Even if people tell you things that are perhaps quite shocking, or they're trying to shock you, just remain completely neutral. Right, well, let's just go on to the next question. Encourage non-verbally, the sort of, well, or almost verbally, it's a bit like, really interested in what you're saying, so that you keep them going. And be a bit careful about note-taking, because it's good to take notes because you might want to follow up on questions, but if you end up taking lots of notes, you lose eye contact and you lose the thread of the interview, and that can be a bit dramatic. Let's see, we've talked about those. So special interviews, most of you will not be interviewing young children because you do need their parents' permission if they're under 16. But if they're friends and relations, well, I guess that's another matter. But it's not advised to interview under the age of 4 because their concrete memory is quite unusual and quite strange, and you'll find that out when you start asking them. They might remember what happened yesterday, but whatever's important to them may not be important to your research study. So it'll be a strange interview. If you're interviewing up, it's suggested you don't go out with a whole pile of questions, because in the 20 minutes that you probably will have to get access and actually get into the interview, they may only answer one of them. So the suggestion is that you start out with the one question that you really want them to answer. Just throw it on the table and let them go, and then furiously follow up with questions about whatever it is that they're saying. At least you'll get some good data that way. And most people, once they've agreed to be interviewed, will talk, and they will talk for perhaps the 20 minutes. For a normal interview, how long should you be in the field? Probably an hour is reasonable, but with some sort of before and after time for rapport and debriefing. Postmodern interviewing is another option, and it sounds easy, but it's actually not easy to do, because it's a bit, phenomenology uses the same approach, where you're literally asking someone, what is your experience? What is your experience now? And whatever they say, you follow up. You don't say, oh, well, I've just been interviewing so-and-so and he said this. You don't do that. You just allow them to define what's important to them, and that's all that you follow up. You can, of course, utilise this approach as part of what you're doing in a more empathetic interview, so you can move amongst approaches. Don't feel that you're going to be stuck with one. You're supposed to share your analysis and interpretation. That's usually done at the end of the interview. Okay, these are the main points that I've got. Do you agree? What else do you want to add? And ownership is supposed to be collaborative in postmodern interviewing. The researcher is what we call decentered. They're off stage. They're not centred and totally in control of it. They give equal power to the participant. Questions, and the questions that you design, are really important. Remember, they're the what, how, when, where and why questions, first of all. You usually start off with a very open descriptive question. What was your experience of that? And let them go. It settles down the interviewee. It allows you to listen to what they're bringing out, and then you start following up from there. It also means that you respect what it is that they have to say. You don't waste a lot of time getting demographic data, how old are you, use those at the end of the interview, not at the beginning. So settle down, get their view, and away you go. And then you come in with your other questions, which we call probes. And there's a range of probes that you can use. Mostly it's just, tell me more about that, and I'm really interested in that. But you can do what's called a devil's advocate, which is when you actually challenge someone. You said that down there, and now you're saying this, and they just don't match. So putting people on the spot has to be done fairly selectively, as is the use of the why question, because that can also put people on the spot. Very useful when you're interviewing up, probably used more cautiously when you're not interviewing up. Your non-verbal probes, keep it all coming. The reflective stuff that you do about halfway through, and then your summary at the end. That just allows for any other further probes. Avoid yes-no questions, that is the questions that are dichotomous, that could easily be answered by a yes or a no. 2-in-1 questions, as I said before, are really quite problematic, so just keep them simple, keep them straightforward. Don't repeat questions, because people will recognise immediately, hey, he actually asked me that further back. Didn't he or she listen to my answer? And levels of meaning are also quite interesting. When you're interviewing people from certain ethnic backgrounds, they will often say yes as the first response, and you think they're saying yes to the question. In fact, they're saying, yes, I understood what you said, but yes, I'm thinking about the response, so don't interrupt me till I've actually said it. So be aware that there are different spaces in the silence between different races. Well, just to sum up on face-to-face interviewing, probably the most important thing is just to have a very relaxed interview so that it's a conversation between two friends. Make sure that your preparation is good and that you've got enough questions to get you through probably anything up to an hour. Now, that may vary depending on who you're interviewing. It might be considerably shorter. But also make sure that you've got enough questions to answer your research question, and that's the most important thing. Make sure that the participant's fully informed about the whole process and you address any ethical issues that are going to be important. Make sure you summarise at the end so that you know where you're going and they know where you've been and what you're going to take out of it. And those, I think, are the major things. So good luck.
Welcome back, students. As you heard from Professor Grebich, there are some important considerations when undertaking interviewing. The take-home message here is the importance of your question design, making sure that you ask the right question in order to elicit the depth and quality of data from your interviewee. By asking the right question at the right time will give you the depth and quality of material which you will later transcribe and analyse in your draft method submission. Like Professor Grebich suggested, why not pilot or trial your questions on a family friend who is not taking part of your project. This way, you'll be able to ensure that you have gotten to your first interview with the right questions. Of course, you'll have the opportunity to reflect on your questions, as your data collection is an iterative process, so you can modify or tweak as you go along by documenting your decisions. Remember that it's no longer a requirement to keep a journal, as mentioned by Professor Grebich. So what's ahead for this week and for next? In your workshop this week, you'll have the opportunity to consider the format of your interviews and practice interviewing and design your questions. These will be required when you submit a draft of your methods section at the beginning of week 6. This is timed so that you'll be able to receive feedback before you commence your data collection. Next week's theme will be on focus groups and observation. In addition to your lecture and readings, choose either to read The Tea Room Trade or Being Sane in Insane Places. There is a content warning for The Tea Room Trade. If you have any questions from this week's lecture and reading, make sure you document them on your worksheet and bring them along to your workshop. See you next week. Bye for now.